CityCast from Explocity.
Every 15th of August, the anniversary of Partition, I think of my interviewees and those who've died. I remember each and every one of them, how they told their stories with courage, speaking as if it were yesterday. It felt present to them. It had just lain dormant for all those years. The bureaucrats who drew the boundary line nearly 75 years ago could not erase their histories, memories, emotions. The partition generation with their unique stories know a truth. Even with a man-made border on each side, the sky remains the same. The birds sing no differently. The earth smells the same after the rains. There was division, but some things real or remembered cannot be divided. It was a British border drawn to divide British India as the British Empire started to be dismantled. Subjects of the Raj came to Britain and are its citizens, and multiple generations live in these isles in their millions. Partition and the end of empire could not be a more British story. The author and artist Edmund de Waal says of the descendants of Holocaust survivors that they grow up aware of the silences. You're completely aware of what you're not being told, of those protected spaces of anxiety. What do you do with that? You can either just move on, or you can go into them. And the moment you go into them, you have to go through to the end. You are in free fall. The same could be said for the children and grandchildren of partition. They have a choice. Once they know about the historical event, they face a decision. If they choose to enter the protected spaces of anxiety, as Maz, Kieran, Sparsh and Benita have, they are in free fall, irreversibly. How could they not be? Britain too faces a choice about its past. Understanding, learning, teaching partition and empire is not a threat. It is British history. It is part of the long story of Britain. We are here because you were there. What I have only understood in the last few years is that acceptance of British South Asians is also an acceptance of their long history, including the story of colonialism. Ultimately, it is acceptance it is British history, that we too are just as British, that our stories need to be heard, told and represented, and not just for a designated month. I think of the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren across Britain today, unpicking the complexity of that era, wanting to understand their past, to understand themselves. And all I can think of are the silences, the wasted years where no one asked or spoke, how even the very word partition, representing one of the most seismic historical events of the 20th century, was not widely known. These inheritors of partition and empire, whether they have South Asian heritage or not, will determine what they pass on of this shared history, what is remembered and what is forgotten. The legacy will live on in ways we do not yet know. It happened long ago, but somehow I feel we're only at the beginning of understanding it, within families and in Britain. My feelings for Lahore have never subsided. I asked my friend who was travelling there whether they'd been struggling to get copies of my book from India to leave one under a park bench, just so it could touch its earth. I wanted to know it was in Pakistan, somewhere in the place my dad grew up and then fled. He wanted to go back, but never did. In a tiny way, the book was a return, and I will go there, for him, for me. And when I do, I'll be there with his grandchildren, my children, walking by my side. They know their history. They are its keepers, for now.
For those who might not know, when Pakistan was carved out of India to serve as a separate country for Muslims in the subcontinent, people on both sides of a hastily defined border found their lives uprooted. The tales from Partition are many and horrific. The stories expose the raw side of a humanity filled with hatred, with mobs red in tooth and claw setting upon each other. The announcement of partition caused Hindu-Muslim violence to break out, some claim unexpectedly. Millions fled their homes in fear to cross the border to safety. Most of them had to leave their lives and all their possessions behind. Some of them found a new home in England. They battled things like racism and alienation and dug their heels in and got their lives back. My guest today, Kavita Puri, is a British journalist and radio broadcaster. She is also the daughter of one of those who fled their homes. For many years now, Kavita has documented the oral histories of the immigrants from the Indian subcontinent to a post-war Britain. Her series, titled 3 Pounds in My Pocket, tells the stories of these pioneer immigrants. Her show, Partition Voices, records the first-person accounts of people directly impacted by partition. So what are oral histories? Academics will tell you that oral history focuses on recording and interpreting the voices of individuals who might have been left out of history. It's all about preserving an alternative form of public record. But that is the boring version. Any writer or journalist will tell you that stories are about people and their lives, their thoughts, fears, and dreams. Recording their history requires a good measure of sensitivity. So the more you feel a connection to their story, the better you can retell it. Kavita Puri has lived inside the story of the people who were victims of the partition, and she is deeply attached to these stories. What you heard earlier was Kavita reading from the final chapter of the latest release of Partition Voices. At one point, Kavita was overcome with emotion and we had to stop recording for a bit. For the reason of this raw and honest emotion, maybe, her book is compelling, and I understand now why that book spoke to me. And it is my privilege to be able to introduce her to speak to us all today. So here's Kavita Puri joining me from what I am told is a hotel room in Spain.
I'm in Spain, yes.
Lucky you, Kavita Puri. Welcome to the Literary City.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with you. Thank you for having me.
You wrote that it took your interviewees 70 years before they would even speak about partition. Why?
Well, remember we're talking about the diaspora here, and there were silences in the diaspora, but there were also silences on the Indian subcontinent. It's not unique to the diaspora, but there are some things that are similar and some things that are different. So the people that came to Britain in those early post-war years were mostly people whose lives had been so disrupted by partition that the worst had already happened and they'd perhaps uprooted once already. So why not come to Britain when the call was made out for people looking to the former colonies? So they came to Britain and they brought those stories of partition with them, those memories, but they didn't talk about it. Because, I mean, like in the 50s and 60s, life was pretty hard for them. They were fighting against racism. They were fighting for equal pay. And interestingly, they were fighting largely Muslim, Sikh, Hindus together. That was the difference between being in Britain and being on the Indian subcontinent. And they were looking ahead. They couldn't look to the past. It was too much. And then they had children who were born in Britain. And those children went to school and they never learnt about partition at school. And I think what we share with the Indian subcontinent is there is a lot of shame and dishonor attached to partition memories. Of course, all sides were felt the loss of their homeland or suffered hugely, but all sides were perpetrators too, and all sides were bystanders. And so these things are difficult to talk about because bad things may have happened in families, been perpetrated by family members, been seen by family members. These are not easy things to talk about, and these are difficult things to disentangle. But I would say also in Britain, there is an institutional silence about partition, about empire. And so, as I said, people don't learn about it in schools. And it means that people like me who went through an entire school system and never learnt about, colonial history of any shape, you don't even know the word partition. It's a very odd thing. And so it's very easy for it not to be brought up. And I think you need a public space to be able to talk, but you also need somebody to ask.
So, was it simply that no one asked?
I think it depends on the family, and of course, there were some people that did tell their story, but I think often what happens is you tell fragments. That's how memories are passed on, and they're carefully selected fragments. So I say about my family that nobody talked about partition. That's not quite true, because people did. What they said was our Muslim neighbors, saved us. That's what I knew. That's all I knew. I just didn't know saved from what.
Surely the next generation expressed some curiosity.
We are only now, I would say, probably in the last 5 years, as members of the diaspora, really articulating and demanding our history. And I think that when that wasn't the case, we didn't know what to ask. If a lot of the third generation I speak to didn't even know the word partition, what is there to ask? And you just assume that your family story begins in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, because why would you think otherwise? And that's what I mean, is there is this kind of unpicking now, because people now do have this kind of historical context, or a beginning to, and there is a huge yearning to know their own history before their ancestors came to Britain, because that informs their identity as part of the diaspora. And so the asking is now, but it wasn't then.
Do you suppose it was also because the first immigrants felt like guests in Britain and didn't want to blame their host?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I think in the 50s and 60s, it was a luxury to be able to even think about history and to kind of contemplate that. They were just existing day to day. It was a very hard life for them. But I think it's important to say, certainly from the interviews that I've done, people have a very different view of who to blame for partition. Whether is it the British, or is it Mountbatten, or is it the neighbor in your village, or is it those people, the mobs that came in, or is it Nehru, Gandhi, Jinnah? It's a very complicated thing. And so, yeah, of course you're not going to turn up and start blaming the British, but I don't think they would have had the vocabulary for that. And that was not at the forefront of their minds in those post-war years when they came.
Right. But the worst thing was for them to blame themselves. Now, in your book, you quote Anindya Roy Chowdhury, and it reads, "For all the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, in most cases it was easy to distinguish between bad and good. In partition, it just isn't." And you ask, how do families cope with partition when your uncle or your father may have killed their neighbor? Was this a continuing thread in your interviews?
I think that what you have to remember is, when you ask people about their memories 70 years on, of course they can tell you the story, but it's never going to be the whole story. And people tell you what they want. Is it people are always selective. And that's the case for people who have the lived experience, or for politicians and civil servants. And maybe you suppress those memories that you don't want to remember. But there were many instances where I did gently try to press. So, for example, one of my interviewees, he was a 15-year-old boy going through the streets of Delhi, trying to make it to safety at in Old Delhi and make it onto a train to Pakistan. And he was walking through a Hindu village and the young Muslim girls were being taken away. And I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Nothing." And I said, "Oh, nothing." And he said, "If I had done anything, I would have been killed." And so I just looked ahead and kept walking. And so, And then he said something like, "Thank God it wasn't my sister." That's all I could think of. And then there was another instance of a Sikh man go back to Gotcha. He was 12 in what became part of India, and he went to an elderly Sikh relative, like distant relative, and he had taken a young, beautiful Muslim girl, and he was force feeding her pork fat in front of other Sikhs. Yeah, and it was very humiliating. And I said to him, "Do you think?" He was so disturbed. He ran home to his mother, and he said, "I have seen this." And the mother said, "They are barbarians, those people who've done that to that girl." And I said, "Do you think she was raped?" And he said, "Almost certainly." And I said, "But did no one in the village say something to this man?" And he said, "No, because we knew the same was happening to our women as well." And that wasn't him. He's a 12-year-old boy when this happens. He was justifying why nobody in the village called this elderly man out.
Yes, I do remember that passage. Such cruelty. Now, to quote you from your radio show Partition Voices, the episode titled Aftermath, you said, "For centuries, the Punjab had been a melting pot of cultures where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived a peaceful existence. When they turned on each other, here it was like an internecine war. To what do your interviewees ascribe this ease of violence?"
Mm-hmm. So it's important to say it was largely harmonious. I mean, there were differences. People did not intermarry, and there were, in some cases, economic differences, and people, for example, didn't always eat together, but people largely did get on. But there were localized cases of intercommunal violence, but nothing like this kind of what historians ascribe to as end of empire violence that was almost kind of genocidal in nature. And I think it's something that historians today still haven't quite understood, how a society that was so close could have disintegrated to the extent it did so horrifically and so quickly. And it is complicated because sometimes it was neighbor against neighbor, but sometimes it was much more organized paramilitaries and militias who had equipment and weaponry from, disbanded from the Second World War. But this demonization of the other wasn't something that had just happened around that time. It was certainly exacerbated, but as many historians ascribe to the decades leading up to that, divide and rule had been very strong.
I wonder about that sometimes, if this whole business of violent attitudes hasn't been already baked into our DNA. For example, I lived in Delhi during the anti-Sikh riots following Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, and I was witness to some unspeakable horrors. And then I read this chapter that you wrote on Manik Dalal, where he was talking about groups of Sikh people who were trying to prevent Muslims from fleeing India just so that they could kill them. You quote Dalal as saying that they waited patiently. I mean, this goes beyond premeditation. This is dry hatred. I really don't understand it. And I wanted to ask you about this business of who's the victim here.
I think it's really complicated, but what I would say is the thing about partition, there are two narratives going on, and perhaps the state wants to, and like when I say the state, I don't just mean India, I mean states on the Indian subcontinent want to suppress that, one of the narratives. There is one narrative that is as you describe, and it is of violence and horror. But there is another narrative too, which if you listen closely to the partition generation, you will hear too, which is one of friendship and love and with your neighbor of the other religion, and that you could live side by side with ease with people of the other religion. And when that generation is no longer with us, and that is not long now, I would say, there is no one to say out loud, but it wasn't like the version that you are saying, that it was different, that we could get on. And my worry is that this other narrative, which is their very nuanced narrative of what it's like to live with other people of other religions, will diminish, and that the louder state narrative that that particular country was a victim and not a perpetrator, which we know is just not true, will be louder, and that will get passed on. And so there are two narratives happening at the same time that are almost seemingly contradictory. And the personal and the state narrative has somehow not come together. But I also think what has also happened on particularly the Indian subcontinent is everyone did suffer hugely. And I'm not just talking about kind of physical violence or actual loss of life. I'm talking about loss of your home, loss of your land that people lived on for generations. And I think there has never been a collective acknowledgement of that loss that everybody felt and that everybody still endures today. And I do think that if that place was found where each country could accept that they all lost something, whether it was people or their women or their land. I'm not talking about a reversal of partition, but it's just an acceptance that everybody suffered, just as everybody was a perpetrator. I do think that would be the beginning of reconciliation, but I don't see that happening now. And until it doesn't, it's very easy to stir up those old hatreds. It takes very little, actually. And it may well be due to partition, and it may not be, but it's easy to draw the line to that. People can do that.
Did those people feel that partition was unavoidable?
I don't think they say that partition was about to happen. I think because partition wasn't inevitable.
And did you find any among them who actually supported partition?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. There are some things that you can say are generalities, but there are people who think partition was a right thing because there were people who were part of the Muslim League that wanted Pakistan. What I would say is you can want partition, i.e. you can want to have Pakistan. You may not have wanted this partition, one that was done in 10 weeks, one that was done in an incredibly botched way, one that was done without any planning or thought that people in their millions would migrate, where thoughtless lines would be drawn across, agricultural land, separating, where things are processed from where things are grown. And I think that's two different things, if that makes sense.
Oh, yes, completely makes sense. And I must also say that in several points in different interviews, there are people who said that it's not that we didn't have our differences, but we would have sorted them out. And this partition brought things to bear in the most ugly way. Let's talk about the next generation. Is partition important to them, and can they easily learn about it?
I think for those who are interested, partition is important because, I know it's 75 years ago, but that is quite recent history. You can still sometimes touch that time, that generation.
As indeed you do, but do they want to know?
I think they do want to know because as I discovered that, people want to go back to that homeland. They want to understand. They don't understand, and going back to contradictions, why they can't talk about it in their family, but yet their family member who lived through partition calls that place that no one speaks of home. It's like, what the hell? So they want to go back to that place. They want to understand. My only sadness is it's so late that the people who hold the key are now no longer with us.
On the matter of culture, a West Indian friend once told me that she thought it would be easier for them to integrate into British society more easily because of an affinity with religion and culture than it would be for Indians and Pakistanis. Isn't that a bit old?
I think that, if you look at the British South Asian community and you look at the evidence, some groups in the British South Asian community have done better. So if you look at the Indian community, for example, on all the kind of stats that the kind of government website puts out, on social indicators, they have thrived better. Like look at, we've got Rishi Sunak, who could be our prime minister. And so I would say some groups within the community have fared better than other groups.
Economically, maybe, but I was speaking at a purely cultural level.
I think, again, it depends which group you're asking. And I also think it depends where you are in Britain. Like in London, it's very easy to, have respect of many, many different cultures. I think we've been here 3-4 generations, and so a lot of British culture is also from the Indian subcontinent. I mean, Robin Cook, our foreign secretary, said our national dish is chicken tikka masala.
Not in India.
Pretty much every high street has some restaurant from the Indian subcontinent. So I would say it goes both ways. I think that the culture from the Indian subcontinent is part of British culture, actually. There is a cultural integration, but there is also an economic integration. And you could argue that the two overlap. But I think that increasingly, I think there's a long way to go, but increasingly, cultural depictions are improving hugely.
Right. I see what you're saying. So we've had tandoori nights, goodness gracious me, the Kumars at whatever address they were in. And so are you saying that comedy has moved on from this pointed ethnicity?
Yeah, I mean, when Goodness Gracious Me came out, it was a really huge moment. And it was the first time I think a lot of us would say, wow, that is, our experience. And it was pretty groundbreaking. But it was also, something that we could talk about in the playground, and, our English counterparts would, say, oh yeah, we watched that too. I watched it with my parents. It was very unifying.
Goodness gracious me was quite popular among the English-speaking crowd in India, especially that guy who wants to claim everything to be Indian.
Indian.
Yes, everything was Indian.
Shakespeare, Indian.
Very good. And don't forget Queen Elizabeth too. So before we go, in 2017, you wrote, or you said, as I watched the Passchendaele 100-year commemorations marking First World War and heard subsequent generations talk of how they never knew about their relatives' past, I feel we are lucky enough to have a small window of time to ask those who are still alive. So was that your motivation?
100% my motivation. Well, it was my motivation to have it on the historical record. Partition was so monumental as a historical event, a huge moment in the 20th century that still shapes the Indian subcontinent today. And I found the amnesia about it in Britain, whether in families or kind of institutionally, I just found it quite baffling. I still do, really. And so that being the case, I knew it was a race against time. And I didn't even know if people would speak to me. I hoped they would. But going back to what I said to at the beginning, if you don't ask, you'll never know. If you don't ask, people won't tell.
And it's a good thing then that you did ask and they did speak. More power to your elbow. And on that note, Kavita Puri, thank you so much for being my guest today on The Literary City.
Oh, it's been so wonderful to join you and your such insightful questions. Thank you.
That was Kavita Puri, author of Partition Voices, Untold British Stories. Follow the link in the podcast description to where you can and should buy the book. And I'll be back with What's That Word? And I'm back with What's That Word? The show where we have fun with words and phrases that we use all the time but never stop to think about. And to help me with it, my co-host, you've met her before.
Hello, my name is Pranati, but you can call me P. That's P with an A. Not another E.
Hello, P with an A. What's cooking?
After listening to Kavita Puri, nice interview, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
I can tell you it will not be bubble and squeak.
Cabbage heaven. Do you put salt in it?
Hey, but you spent some time in England, didn't you?
Not continuously, but substantially.
And what did you do there?
Other than work and business, I was mainly being a bad boy.
Well, did you have much to do with the diaspora in London?
Not even a little. I did try to make Indian friends, but they didn't like me.
Why not?
I finally asked someone, and she said it was because I was not Indian enough.
That's absurd. What does that even mean?
I really have no clue. Maybe it was because I was listening to Respighi's Pines and Villas of Rome on my Walkman, like a bollocks.
And you're a bollocks for listening to classical music?
No, for using a Walkman, of course.
So I take it your pals were...
Locals Englishmen. Great guys to be bad boys with.
Why am I not surprised?
Actually, my pals were great fun. We were in our 20s and it was all about pub quizzes and Trivial Pursuit and limericks competitions and being bad boys.
Next time, call me.
That would be a waste of time. Those bozos are toothless now.
Okay, but did you at least win?
You mean the pub quizzes? Yes, I used to win the limericks competitions quite often. But in Trivial Pursuit, I once made it right to the end, but I bombed on my final question.
Oh, really? What was the question? Do you remember?
I can never forget it, to my eternal shame.
What was the question?
You will not believe this. It's the last question of Trivial Pursuit. If I get this, I'll win £100 and all the glory. And the question is, what flag flies over the cities of Bombay and Bangalore?
Wait, you're kidding.
No?
But, well, which one? Like a Maratha, Shivaji?
Exactly. That's what I guessed, and it was wrong.
Okay, so what's the right answer?
The flag of India.
Groan. Boo.
Boo is right.
WTF, dude.
Ironical. But one must remember that this was England, and the meta-reference for them for this question would have been the Indian flag.
Right.
Well, I blew it. On to the show, P with an A. What's that word?
A phrase from your monologue. Red in tooth and claw.
I thought you might pick up on that, actually.
Yeah, because I don't know anything about that phrase. But if I had to guess, I'd say it has something to do with feral animals attacking each other and getting tooth and claw red with blood.
Yes, bang on. That's what it means.
So, well, get to the etymology then.
All right. So first, there have been references to tooth and claw since for a very long time in literature, principally from the Bible and Shakespeare. Same difference. and both have abundant references to these. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That figures in the Bible.
Right. Yeah, I thought so, yeah.
Yes, but the more recent source is from Alfred Tennyson in his epic poem titled In Memoriam, AHH. That's the title. It was written in 1850. He uses that phrase. By the way, epic poem generally means very long, very boring, and no one has read it.
Guilty. And with that title.
Me too. But anyway, Tennyson's Canto number 56, which in my opinion is 55 too many, it refers to man in general and faith. And here are the lines. Who trusted God was love indeed, and love's creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with ravine shrieked against his creed.
What was his problem?
Well, this stanza questions faith upon the death of his good buddy, Arthur Henry Hallam, AHH in other words, and Tennyson asked about the conflict between the concept of Christian love and its coexistence with the brutal side of nature, red in tooth and claw.
Aw, that is touching.
If nature is purposeless and heartless, Tennyson commented, in Goodreads or Amazon, I forget which, how can he believe in creation's final law? But as a Christian, how could he not?
Gosh, such inner conflict.
Truly, it's a wonder he didn't off himself. Much safer to write a poem about it. Anyway, some years later came Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest theories, which was all about teeth and claws, and Tennyson's poem was quoted quite frequently during those discussions.
Okay, that's interesting.
But I was intent on finding an Indian context for this phrase, from Indian history, and I did.
Really? And what's the reference?
In the Irish paper, the Downshire Protestant, in their edition of 25th September 1857, marked the year, they published an article praising an Adjutant General of the Indian Army, Henry Havelock, for having retaliated against some of those who had taken part in what they called the Indian Mutiny of 1857. The lines are quite chilling and it's disturbing, and it reads, "That dark demon, Nana Sahib and his thousands, tracking the monster while he was yet reeking with the carnage of Kanpur, burning his lair, and still following him on towards Lucknow with 1,400 Europeans, putting to flight 10,000 sepoys, and so pursuing the fiendish Raja and his murdering hordes until at last the brown waters of the Ganges roll over Nana Sahib and his family, and close forever over the fellest monster, red in tooth and claw, of whom the world has any record."
Wow. Who's Nana Sahib? Never heard of him.
Neither had I, but it's a misspelling, I'm sure. I can tell by the reference to Kanpur that this was Nana Sahib Peshwa. And the reason for the retaliation is because Peshwa opened fire on a boatload of women and children that he had said that he would protect.
What is this hell? Like all's fair in love and war?
I guess so. But who's to know how much of the truth was embellished? Anyway, Hemingway once wrote from his dispatches from Northern Africa, World War II, "Not all the descriptions of its horrors have kept man from war."
Hemingway drank a lot of gin, didn't he?
Lots of it.
Well, me too. Chin chin. Bye.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening and for being here. And remember, hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss another episode of The Literary City. See you again next Wednesday. Bye.